Good evening, everybody. Really delighted to see you again this Thursday evening after what has been quite a long term, let's say, certainly an extraordinary term. The summer term, I think, always feels long, whether you are running a school or a synagogue. I think this year it's been a quite extraordinarily long summer term. And so we come to the final one of these Alyth Online Lectures for this period. This is our 14th lecture since Pesach. So 14 weeks of these. And I just want to say how grateful I am to everyone who has shared their wisdom over the course of the last 14 weeks. It's very appropriate before we break up for the summer that we hear from the head teacher. It's with real delight that I'm going to hand over to Peter in a moment to tell us what education should look like when we come back after the summer holiday. The best way to see this, as ever, is to set your screen to active speaker. That will allow you to see Peter in the corner of your screen whilst he screen shares his presentation. And as ever, after Peter's spoken, there'll be an opportunity for some questions. Once again, we are large this evening, so the only way to do the questions is to send them to me, to josh@alyth.org.uk, and I will build your questions into the conversation that I have with Peter after he's presented. So with no further ado, I'm really delighted to hand over to Sir, as we would have said back when I was at school. And Peter, thank you so much for giving us your wisdom this evening.
Well, thanks, Josh. It's great to be here. Really excited by it. And thanks very much for inviting me. I'm going to just share my screen. I'm going to rely, because Adam's a person I can see at the moment. Is that's Adam's nodding. So this is a sort of title for the moment, and I'll put what I talk about in the context of COVID. But actually, there's in a way a bigger argument that transcends that I want to talk about. And I want to just say just a minute about sort of where my story really. So I was in politics for nearly 10 years. Was an advisor to Tony Blair and was his speechwriter. And then I left there in 2003, December 2003, and then started in a inner city secondary school, a really tough one, in January 2004 as a teaching assistant. And I was hopelessly out of my depth. The students ran rings around me. And yet at the same time, for those 2 weeks, I don't think I've ever had such an exhilarating experience. What was some people's idea, I'm sure, of hell, being surrounded by 1,000 teenagers, I just found completely extraordinary. And I've sort of never looked back since. I wrote about that difference in 1 out of 10 of seeing things from both ends of the telescope, as it were, being in the center of politics and then being on the front line, and how that was very different. I then trained as a history teacher, worked my way up to being a deputy head, and then in 2012 set up a school, School 21, with 2 colleagues in Stratford, which has a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities as well. A 4 to 18 school, so it covers primary and secondary and sixth form. And we were trying to do things very differently there, which I'll explain why we believed in that. So that is a little bit of where I'm coming from. Now, I want to make tonight, this is the overall argument that I'm trying to make, that the old, if you like, familiar settlement that we've all gone by, and both teachers and schools and us as parents have lived by, I think is beginning to break down. And that is that if you do well in academics, you memorize lots of stuff, you try and get into a top university to study a single subject in the main, of course, there's some joint honors as well, then you get, if you work hard, you get your 2-1, and then you pop out the other side and everything will be fine. Well, increasingly, that's not the case anymore. The world is changing, what employers want is changing, and what we need as human beings to thrive is also changing. So as a result, education must change. And we need, if that's the case, to develop the full potential of every child, which I don't believe we're doing at the moment. Now, this is quite a busy slide, and I want to really unpick it. And this goes into that argument in more depth, I think. Our lives as young people and students are bookended by a belief in the whole person. So what's interesting is in the years, in ages 2 to 5, let's say if you're Alyth kindergarten, as I was many, many years ago, the early learning goals measures what's on the left-hand side of this slide, where it says communication, language, physical development. It measures different aspects of the whole child. Yes, it focuses on literacy and maths, but it looks at personal, social, and emotional development. It looks at understanding the world, creativity in the arts, the ability to communicate and speak. And that's what happens up to the age of about 5. Then at the other end, when you pop out, or assuming you go to university and you seek a job, when you're, let's say, 21, what are employers looking for? They're looking for problem solvers, those who can work well in teams, those who communicate really well, those who have a work ethic, those who have got some sense of self-advocacy, being a self-starter. And in between, which is why I put it in red here, we've got these years where that stops being important. The whole person stops being important. And that, it seems to me, is increasingly irrational. So what happens? Why is that the case? Well, it's this tyranny of these single subjects. So we've all just got it into our head that education should be divided, and as you get older, into you going to this history lesson, then you have your trunked up geography lesson, then you have your maths, then you have your English, and most of it is done in a fairly one-dimensional way. The currency of education in those years becomes predominantly, yes, you might be in a school show or play some sport after school, but the main currency is what you've done in your test result. So as you get older, in primary school, this is creeping in as well, but as you get older, what do you come home as a child and say? You say, well, I got 17 out of 20 in my science test. That is, or an equivalent in another subject. That is what is deemed to be success at school. There's very little focus on those communication or collaboration skills, and social and emotional learning is massively underplayed. So this is the strange situation we're in at the moment. And what's increasingly changing, why I'm saying this old settlement is breaking down, is that not only is this on the right-hand side what graduates are looking for, but increasingly big organizations, and for example, the 4 main accountancy firms at the moment, and it's not that accountancy is the be-all and end-all, but where they lead, others often follow, PwC, KPMG, they're now becoming qualifications blind because they believe they're not getting the diverse workforce by just thinking that a 2-1 from a Russell Group University is a proxy for the sort of person they want. And those people haven't got the range of skills that they're looking for. So that's really changing. The impact of this red band in the middle these years and what it takes to shovel people through these increasing exam factories, this is the price. Now, not all of these things here are directly a result of that system. There are other factors that come in, but 40% of teachers, particularly in the state sector, are leaving within 5 years. Only 6%, there's a lot of talk about creativity being squeezed out of the curriculum. Only 6% of young people are doing any drama, music or art in the curriculum. Of course, there might be clubs after school, but in the curriculum from the age of 14. Why? Because they haven't chosen it as a GCSE. Only 6% in each of those choose it as a GCSE. The rest don't get taught it, even though we think these are the great things that make us a civilized person, a civilized society. Now, when GCSEs came in, they were criterion referenced, which means, of course, that if you pass, if you reach the standard, you pass. It's like a driving test. If you reach the standard, you're allowed to pass. What's crept in recent years is they become norm reference. So that means however well a child does, 33, a third of them, roughly, it's not exact, roughly each year, have to fail because it's norm reference. It's in comparison to the others. So unlike the States, for example, where everyone could graduate from high school if you reach the standard, a third which often at the moment, there's a big report out recently called The Forgotten Third, after 12 years of education are just deemed to be failures. And they've got no achievements to their name because we only measure narrow exams, and in them, a third have to fail. And then we know increasingly, and we see this in the news and we know it from friends and family, the stress levels of this exam system. And everything I say really, or vast majority, even though I'm running a state school, I think applies to independent schools and grammar schools, and sometimes the pressure in them is even stronger to meet this conveyor belt to your so-called 2-1 from your Russell Group University. 25% of young girls in a report about 18 months ago have said that they self-harm at some point. So that is, so what does the world need? How do we change it? What does the world need? Now let's look at this. The problems, what people want out there, what employers want, what I think will lead to a fulfilling life, is to be able to bring different disciplines to bear. So not just a single subject, but what people need and what employers want increasingly is creative problem solvers. So if you think of all the things that we've been wrestling with over the last few years, and obviously the highest up on the list is COVID at the moment, these are complex issues. It isn't good enough just to have, gone on a narrow track and become a historian, or gone on a narrow track and become a mathematician. What you want to solve these, and you will use a lot more than what's on the outside. I put some problems in the middle: COVID, knife crime, childhood obesity, free speech and social media, climate change. All of them in different ways require different combinations of the sort of subject knowledge, skills and disciplines on the outside of this square, whether it's statistical knowledge, of course, with COVID at the moment. We need to be educated to know when we look at those tables about who's faring worse or what's happening on COVID, we genuinely can start to compare countries and what's happening. Behavioral science is so much involved, if you take COVID or any of these issues, about the psychology of why someone, what makes some people social distance and not others? What is the likelihood of people sticking to the rules or not? All of that comes under behavioral science. There's a lot on, obviously, epidemiology, but a lot of these are affected by different scientific knowledge. Understanding how the media works, understanding the implications of artificial intelligence, having an ethical, each of these questions have an ethical underpinning. A lot of them are completely different depending on where you are in terms of economic inequality, and where you are in the hierarchy. Design thinking, as we know, is a way of looking at problems to really think hard about how you solve them in a really structured way. So this is the world that we're going into. And one of my colleagues who founded School 21 with me is now setting up one of the first new universities. And it's called the London Interdisciplinary School, and it's a university dedicated not to coming there to study one or a joint honours, but to study problems, and then you learn the subject knowledge that brings to bear on those different problems. So, if that's what we need, how do we go about it? Now we've got a curriculum and approach that we call Head, Heart and Hand, with a very nice diagram here of what that might look like. We believe that if you use those, and I'll explain for the rest of my talk what that means, we think you get this rounded education, you can become those creative problem solvers, and you can lead a more fulfilling life. Now, within that, we talk about oracy, which is a slightly unusual word, some of you may know it, which has come in recent years, and it really is elevating the idea of speaking skills. And our mission at School 21, we've gone really big on this, is to give them equal status to reading and writing, which we think is crucial, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. So again, this is quite an involved slide, and I want to again dwell on this for a few minutes. This is, if you like, our curriculum map, the big overview of it. And it breaks down head, heart, and hand into the component parts. And what is very interesting is that for a lot of the time, going back to this idea of just imparting knowledge to get through exams, is that I think a lot of the time our young people are getting what I call a ninth of a good education, because they're stuck in the top hand corner, the part of the head. And by that, I mean, that is mostly what school is doing. And of course, it's not that we don't believe in that. So should everyone engage with Shakespeare? Yes. Should they engage with scientific discovery or the history of our nation and the nations of the world? Of course. And so that idea from Matthew Arnold of learning about the best that has been thought and said, or some people say standing on the shoulders of giants, is of course incredibly important. But we often now, because of the cramming in the curriculum of the quantity of information, which somehow people think is more important than understanding the ideas behind it. So just, I mean, as anyone who knows who's got a teenage child at home, to do triple science now at school is 1,000 pages of 3 different books to learn and memorize in 2 years. So that's what you have to do to get physics, biology, and chemistry at GCSE. So what's being lost is, in Michael Oakeshott's words, the great conversation of humanity is to enter in to those big ideas and big concepts. And what we do at School 21 is build out from those ideas so that young people are engaging with them, and then the detailed knowledge, which you still need, but maybe not to the same quantity, folds in behind. Applying and combining knowledge, I think, is left out a lot. The application of knowledge, not just the learning of knowledge. So what do we do? How do we make sense of that knowledge now? And sometimes those who believe in just cramming young people with knowledge don't have that sense that knowledge is active and it is something you apply, and it's something that in each age you think about it anew and apply it to the circumstances you're living in. So, and it's this idea of empowering knowledge, knowledge that empowers, not just knowledge of the powerful, not just passing on the knowledge. Now, under heart, which again, I think every school has a pastoral system, and I'm not really talking about that. That's normally, behavior codes and things. Are we really learning at school and being thoughtful and intentional about how we develop the well-being, the growth mindset, the resilience, the empowerment of every young person? So how is every child finding something that they can really get good at, understanding their identity? If you're a Muslim girl growing up in East London, you've got multiple identities. So how are you making sense of that? How is school helping you to make sense of that? Building relationships, a tolerance of difference, this is increasingly important. The idea of listening, not just talking, and listening is a skill that we can teach, and we do teach at our school really intentionally. A very good quote here: we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should use them proportionally. But also increasingly, where we know from social media that everyone is living in their own echo chamber, it's actively at school building that sense of different opinions, multiple lenses on things, so that people can get a sense of perspective. And it leads nicely to the third one, which is about, there's so many issues, like some of the problems I've already touched on, like living through COVID, which doesn't fit neatly in our very traditional national curriculum, but deserves to have a place at school where people can really get underneath the values and the meaning behind them, whether it is climate change, whether it's the young people who I serve in our community in Newham, scared to walk home because of knife crime, to have deaths, 100 yards from people stabbed 100 yards from our school. People have got to make sense of these issues and understand what's going on. So again, how is that done in terms of developing the heart? And then the hand, creativity, the idea that everyone is developing passions, of understanding the different ways of looking at life and seeing the beauty within life. Learning to create, that sense, which I'll come back to, of drafting something until you create beautiful work. And then whilst at school, this idea that you can change the world. When we created the school, we started with a slogan, which was "Today Matters." And it was the antidote to what I thought had become the subliminal message of a lot of schooling, which is it's going to be pretty grim, a real drag, but it will all be worth it because you'll get your bit of paper at the end, and then you'll go on to the next stage. And I wanted, with that message of Today Matters, to say here and now, whether you're a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 16-year-old, whatever it may be, you can create work of value whilst you're at school. So the currency of a school is not just the 17 out of 20 in a science test, but is the work you're producing, work that lives beyond the classroom. And we talk a lot about creating beautiful work. So this is a head, heart and hand curriculum. And it is a way, and we're at the foothills of this. We've been going 7 or 8 years. Some of these things we've really embedded. Some of them we need to do far more of. But it is our vision of what we're trying to achieve by developing the school. So what does good learning look like? Is it this? Now, these next 4 slides are very deliberately, I mean, they are what a classroom has looked like at 20, 30-year intervals over the last 120 years. And what is so extraordinary, give or take the desk or the inkwells or possibly the class sizes, is that it is very familiar. That's the 1970s moving into the 80s. But what's pretty chilling is that most classrooms, most of the time, could look or do look like they did 120 years ago. And yet, and this is the key point, if you're trying to teach this, then if you're doing the top left-hand cultural literacy, then of course, one way of doing that is to lecture the students and line them up in rows. But if you're the bottom right-hand corner, trying to encourage and create a workshop in your classroom where young people can set up a social enterprise to try and change something in their local area, then you wouldn't want lined up in rows. You'd want a greater repertoire. So if I think of the sort of images that have come from the learning at our school, it's ways of engaging, again, this idea of oracy and discussing ideas, of doing and making in projects. We have at the end of each term a community exhibition of all the beautiful work that's done. We've done that every single term since we opened in 2012. And students stand there justifying their work, being questioned on their work, and telling the story of how they've developed and how they've crafted what they've done. Speaking to other audiences, this is, which I'll come back to, real world learning partnerships where there are placements within organizations, including this. Using technology and collaborating using technology from a young age, collaborating on a writing project. Setting up a cafe to invite the community in from scratch with all the menus, the branding, the food, buying it, making it, you know, and these are primary school children. So, if we think about all these, what do we want learning to look like? What is the type of learning we think is right if we want that head, heart and hand curriculum? So let's get into the educating the head, heart and hand in a little bit more practice, in a little bit more detail, and see what it's actually like in practice. So this was a Shakespeare project where we found out at the local cinema they were doing Romeo and Juliet. So we discussed with the cinema whether the culmination of the project, which gave an incentive for the students, was to study Romeo and Juliet, and then produce their analysis, which was then put up in the foyer for people coming to the cinema to then question the students on, or the students to give them a short talk about. So again, it's a way of bringing the head, it's applying the knowledge to a real life situation. This is again a primary school child of about 7, whose writing, crafted again painstakingly, is then produced with all classmates in a book, and this one was about, as you can see here, about community heroes. Again, bringing alive the learning. It's not that they weren't doing, you know, complex writing and learning the basics of writing. It's not that they haven't learned phonics in great detail, which is essential. It's that they're lifting their learning and giving it a real power, so that this child, Marcel, is a you know, published author at a very young age. Again, this is a maths project where they had to measure, I've forgotten exactly what the details were of it. This one is a couple of years ago, but they were measuring different things in the playground. They were working in teams to get the right answers. But again, it was bringing maths alive in different ways. This is a French Revolution. You can see a guillotine here somewhere, and very disheveled students who are about to, I think, go to the guillotine. And this was a drama history project. Again, bringing two subjects together with the drama illuminating the learning and getting them underneath what it was to be in the French Revolution. And during COVID, this has happened through remote learning. And it's really been, again, the style we've had. It's not just about sending home worksheets. It's about doing really rich learning that brings it alive. So this is for all different year groups, the online resources that, for example, in, you know, this one is about having demos done online, and then different ways of following those experiments up at home and then reporting back on them in really interesting ways. So it's that sort of blended learning approach. Spanish, again, it's deciding that, you know, people have got access, or a lot of them do, for cooking at home. So how do we make a Spanish tortilla, but how do we do it all in Spanish, and then describe what we've done in Spanish, but also produce something in theory beautiful and edible at the end of it. This is an e-portfolio. Everyone got a digital portfolio. And what was really interesting, I've been looking at these recently, is how it also records the stuff that's almost in the cracks of the curriculum, in the sense that, you know, some students have written a news diary. For some of them, the George Floyd death was incredibly powerful and scary, and they wanted to reflect on that, and they themselves decided to write a news diary following the news of what was going on. And that wasn't something, that wasn't a piece of homework from school, but it was something, whilst they had the ability to do that in an e-portfolio, a digital portfolio, they could do that as well as recording some of the work that they were doing. You know, here's examples of annotating poetry, which then they take a photo of and upload onto their digital portfolio to show how they progressed in that different way. So there are many ways in both. Look, we do quite a lot of traditional teaching of different subjects discreetly, but we're also bringing them alive in ways that make the head bit of the curriculum really powerful. So empowering knowledge, not just knowledge of the powerful. Educating the heart. Now we start with circles, and our school is very much about the power of the circle rather than the row. And this is about, sometimes in America they call it crew. It's our way of doing form time, but we invested a lot of money in not having tutor groups or form groups of 20, 25, but having 12 or 13 who could really be known. And we had several hours, not just sort of 10 or 15-minute check-in, where they could develop a relationship with the teacher and really grow. And this is where they did a lot of oracy, and they did a lot of, we have a well-being curriculum bespoke to each year group that has been really well thought about and done through texts. We've also, during COVID, and this is where the heart and the community building comes in, we've had a lot of children who didn't have access to free school meals because of the government cock-ups on that. We had about a quarter in one of our schools that didn't have access to any digital technology or the internet. So we've had to provide, and some families didn't have complete basics of toiletries of various kinds. So we've been collecting that together, providing packs for people at home, sometimes doing home visits to help, sometimes providing toys to those who haven't got enough toys at home. And that is part of this idea of the education of the heart, and also a building community. We've also had books that people can collect and own themselves. They're not just library books, some of which have donated, some of which we've put towards that. So, and yeah, I suppose the thing to emphasize here is how much we combine the idea of head and heart. And I think anyone who's had children at home realizes it is, I think it's brought home, I think why COVID has made this head, heart and hand idea so much more powerful is, as I sort of mentioned a bit before, it can't just be enough to have a sort of worksheet or continue the academic stuff. All of us have gone through ups and downs in terms of our emotional well-being and need support in different ways. And so schools like ours that have done regular check-ins, one-to-ones, speaking to the family regularly, having a tracker of who's vulnerable and who needs most support is incredibly important. And coming on to the hand, what it also means is we know that some of the things that our own children have done and young people have done generally is about doing and making and being creative. It's learning how to animate online. It's becoming a great cook. It's doing things with friends. It's doing a whole series of dance routines on TikTok. It's ways of bringing out your creativity at this time, which are really, really important. So to look at the hand in practice, these are our sixth formers who created a social enterprise called Project Home. And they've been working with homeless charities because they decided as students that the thing that most worried them in Newham was the number of homeless people in the local Stratford Centre. And they got some of the charities together. They got the council to do more than they were doing at this point. They did a Kickstarter campaign to get a video going, really high quality video, which was narrated by one of the homeless people living there, but was filmed by the students and edited by them. And that was something that they had the impetus. It was in curriculum time and they learned a huge range of skills as well as making a difference to the world. There was plans for a concrete factory which would have really damaged the Olympic Park, and a combined maths and English project of our Year 9 students was instrumental. It wasn't the only factor, but it was instrumental in that concrete factory not being built. And again, they were learning a lot of maths and English, but they were putting it to use by plotting what the pollution would be and various other things in order to get that change. These are 3 students who have changed, given more opportunities for sport across the community in the area because they were so passionate about it, and there weren't enough there. Our real world learning placements is, instead of 2 weeks of work experience, we reinvented that, and our year 10s and 12s and 13s go out every week for half a day into an organization to produce, not just doing a bit of photocopying, but doing a real project. And that has become really powerful. This is the Department of Education with the Education Minister, and they had done this really thoughtful project on how they can get more ethnic minorities applying to be civil servants, and they're briefing, that's the Permanent Secretary and the Minister about that. And this was one that you may have seen on the BBC News. This was a project with the woman in the middle there is a 94-year-old former art teacher who was living in a care home. And this is our students and teachers on a Zoom call. And she was teaching a lesson to our students, an art lesson. And again, it was so positive in so many ways, the intergenerational, it was so positive, but also all the stories we're hearing about care homes, just the place where people were dying of COVID gave a more optimistic slant on some of the things that were still possible, given despite some of the grim situations that people were living in. Just to finish on the hand, this idea of crafting work is one of the things that's so powerful. Multiple drafts. In most schools, we don't do multiple drafts. We just do, I as a history teacher used to set a history essay, someone handed it in, a child handed it in, I marked it, moved on to the next thing. But in the real world, I mean, I've done several drafts of this presentation. May have needed several more drafts. That's up to you to decide. But we do that in the adult world, and to get young people trained to do that is really important. We start age 4. This was a Kings and Queens project with reception class. That's the first draft, that's the second, that's the third. Now, we might have patted them on the head for the first, or certainly the second, and with the right protocols and the way of crafting stuff, you get to the third. First and second draft. Now, that may have been admittedly a slight off day on the first draft, but you can see the second draft is so much more powerful. So it's this idea of crafting beautiful work. And holding it together is oracy. We've done this great project with Cambridge University where we've broken oracy down into cognitive, linguistic, physical, social, emotional, different strands to oracy. How do you make an argument? How do you use rich language? How do you hold an audience? How do you listen properly? And this has become really powerful. We've set up a charity. We do assemblies, for example, in very different ways, where there's talk from the moment they get into school rather than again lined up in rows. And we set up a charity, Voice 21, which is working now with 700 schools and thousands of teachers to develop speaking skills in young people in different formats, in different contexts, so they become really articulate, developed speakers, and that they find their voice. Because for us, it's a moral purpose that every child finds their voice, and that's both metaphorical, find out who they are, which is sometimes a life's quest, but also having the techniques to be a really good speaker. And this was, even during lockdown, every year we get every child to do a 5-minute speech with no notes. We did this one through Zoom this year. So from 4-year-old to 18-year-old, they're doing a speech on something that they want to share their voice about. And we spend a lot of time training the young people to be able to do that. So just to wrap up, we talk about moving from a paradigm A to a paradigm B, a paradigm A that is based on Ofsted bearing down on schools, the exam factory, a narrow part of the head. And we're trying to get a more expansive education in B of head, heart and hand. I think COVID has given this fresh impetus. And there's a real, as people have paused and reflected within the education system, I think teachers and leaders and parents and educationists are now clamoring for something that is richer, that does keep people in the teaching profession, that is, yes, less stressful for young people. And that's what we're after. And I think to end on the 4 historic purposes of education, over the last thousands of years, these are basically, there may be 1 or 2 others, what they boil down to. Passing on that knowledge, the best that's been thought and said, a preparation for work, the idea of social action, and education being a liberator, as it is in a lot of developing countries. But the one that when I've asked many leaders, many teachers at lots of sessions where they gravitate, it is the top right-hand one, that education's purpose is to develop human potential in all its forms. And so we need a more expansive education system in order to achieve that. And the mission of Big Education, which is a new organization we've set up, which is a group of schools and social enterprises and a social enterprise, is to provide the tools and the programs and the leadership capacity and give exemplar schools of how this can be done. And there's a growing movement of people who think it can be done and should be done. Thank you.
Peter, thank you so much. So I suppose the first question to ask is, it seems so incredibly compelling. Why aren't all our kids going to schools like that? What's the kind of the big picture that's going on around it? Is there a, but I suppose what I mean is either is there what is the prevailing counter view and why is it so powerful?
Yep.
And against that, and or I suppose, what are the kind of the obstacles to change that are standing in the way of what seems on one level so straightforward?
Yeah, that's the key question. For many years, in different formats, people have been talking more about this. So the question is, I was on a discussion today with a few leaders, so sort of why, first of all, is this a big moment? Partly because of COVID, partly because, as I was arguing, the settlement, the old settlement is breaking down. I think this is a moment. What are the barriers? The main 2 barriers, one I think both apply to the state sector, one definitely applies equally to the independent sector. The one that applies to all schools is the exam factory, is the collusion of all of us, parents, teachers, the system, in believing that exam success is your route to everything, and that our goal is to get to that Russell Group university and then all will be fine. And we all collude in that. And we've got a system that starts with the universities. So to give one comparison again with America, America's got a flawed system in different ways, but the admissions to university are held by a central admissions person and not by the head of subject. So in Britain, crucially, the head of maths at a top university only cares that you're a mathematician, because they want to know you'll be in the PhD group in a few years' time. Whereas in America, you do a broad first year and they care about your resume, and they care that you're interested in sport or the violin or whatever else it may be. And that's a crucial difference. So one is the exam factory and the specialization too early and all the rest of it. And the other is Ofsted, which particularly in the state sector. So Ofsted, which is completely toxic, there is no other sector where at half a day's notice, random people come into your school and pour over it, not in a developmental way, not in a way that says, look, together can we improve the school? You're forced on the back foot, you're forced to hide things from the inspector because it's a game to show yourself in your best light. It's not an open conversation. And then crucially, they label you on a very arbitrary basis after a day or so, whether you're outstanding or good or in special measures. And those in special measures you might think is a kick up the arse and they do better. Of course, all the evidence is they do worse because the best teachers flee a school in special measures. So all the people who created Ofsted, when you had a big tail of underachievement, and it was probably worth it in the first years of Ofsted in the late 80s, now there is less underachievement where you need this sledgehammer. So abolishing Ofsted and abolishing GCSEs would be the first two steps to a more expansive system.
So let me just ask a little bit more then about assessment.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, you've spoken a lot about curriculum, kind of redesign of curriculum.
Yeah.
Are you saying we don't need assessment, or is it the nature of assessment that needs to change? And if so, what are the measurables if you are focusing on different things in your curriculum?
Yeah, so going back to your first question as well, if it were easy to move from, we're measuring the wrong things, but the things that it's a bit easier to measure. So that's why we're doing it. Again, the world has moved on. So one of the creator of GCSEs, Kenneth Baker, who I've been on calls with recently, incidentally, we've got together a really good group of independent schools and state schools. So it's represented by Eton and St. Paul's and all the big independent schools, as well as some state schools. We're trying to crack this. We're trying to look at what should come next. And it's not an easy one. The consensus, including Kenneth Baker, who brought them in, is that you don't need a school leaving age exam at 16 when everyone has to stay in some form of education to 18. So you just get rid of that, basically. And what you do is you probably have a literacy and numeracy check to make sure everyone at 16 is literate and numerate. You might bring that down to 14, but then you have something more expansive. Now, then the hard thing is, how are you going to measure the heart and the hand, not just the head? And there are ways, and the debate is far richer in a lot of other countries, of people looking at different criterion and ability, criteria for doing some of those things. So PISA, which is the international organization at the OECD, is now for the first time in the last 5 years measuring across all 15-year-olds around the world. They started by only measuring traditional English and maths. They're now, and science, they're now measuring creativity, problem solving, and social emotional learning in a way that they think is robust enough to compare nations' 15-year-olds. So if they think they can do it, and they're pretty serious people, I don't think it's beyond us in this country to adapt some of what they're doing to a system that is better. And so what should happen? People should leave school with a portfolio of, yes, academic stuff, but I call it a balanced scorecard of academic stuff under the head, but also stuff under the heart and the hand, and they can show that to employers and also show that to a university as the breadth of what they can do.
And that assumes that the university wants to look at that, of course.
Well,
I mean, I suppose the question is, where do you start? Do you start from the bottom in thinking about how do we redesign primary education without the sorts of summative assessments that are now being built into primary education, or does it require us to start at the other end of the educational journey and rethink what higher education looks like in this country?
Well, I think you've got to probably do both, and Someone very respected, Dylan William, in the education space, who's done a lot of great work in academic, was saying the other day, why do we allow ourselves in schools to do the sorting and comparing for universities? We shouldn't. What we should do is say, a student can present to university one of 2 or 3 different things, either exam results or continuous assessment or a portfolio, and they can choose what they think's the best, and then let university make sense of how they let them do the hard work of how to compare, rather than us having to do that in schools at 16 and 18 in a very clunky way that in no shape or form shows the breadth of what students have been learning.
Let's stay on the kind of the big picture stuff, and then I'd love to ask a little bit narrower questions as well. But in terms of the big picture stuff, I mean, I'm a governor of a school. I'm a governor of a school that is, like most schools, concerned about its ability to balance its books, to, in particular, pay for those subjects which are outside of the core, for, you know, those subjects that we would say with the heart and hand subjects primarily.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't the fundamental issue one of funding underneath all of this? I don't want to ask about how School 21 is funded, but it looks like there's a lot there which is...
No, we're identical. No, and it's absolutely worth saying. We are, and we've just had cuts. We're in Newham. We've got a huge amount of need in terms of mental health services, and we're under-resourced in a lot of those things. We get no special treatment. We're just the normal per pupil funding. So it is tough. And there are tough choices in terms of, can you work with teaching assistants in a more creative way? Can you use people? How do you timetable so you can have those creative subjects and still have your classroom teachers? But as we know, 80% of the budget goes on staffing. So there's very little wiggle room away from the staffing. So all schools have had to make really tough decisions. But, you know, within that context, in a really tough area in Newham, what we've done since opening School 21 has, you know, we have been able to do it because we've been clever and it's not easy in how we've done that. It's not that we've done it perfectly. There's a lot of things we would have liked to have done better. But I don't think funding for me is not the number one, because in a way, I don't know, you've got to live with funding going up and down. I think the barriers of Ofsted and the way the assessment system works, I think are more fundamental, because it puts in the system the wrong incentives right from the start. And so people, you know, so many teachers, I've set up this blog in the last few weeks called Learning from Lockdown. And if anyone wants to see it, it's really that we've got now 80 blogs of really thoughtful people, learningfromlockdown.com. And people in that, the teachers are using this phrase the whole time, I don't want to go back to the treadmill. They saw the cramming for exams. That's why that stat of 40% leaving within 5 years is terrifying. You know, people start with these great intentions of being the people who sort of unearth that greatness in every child, and are reduced to a sort of rag-rated, you know, data-driven. All the conversations they have is with their head of department of, you know, who's 1 point behind or 2 points and who's going to get their GCSE. And that's what too much of our system is being reduced to.
So let's think about teachers a bit more, and the teaching profession a bit more. I mean, obviously you were quite, on one level, quite remarkable in making that decision to step into teaching from something very different, and to bring the inspiration and the skills that you have into the education system. It feels like many more people are making the reverse journey, the opposite journey out of education. How do we ensure that education is teaching is the valued profession that it needs to be, recognizing that behind all of this, the teacher is the decisive element in the classroom, right?
Yeah. I think it all goes back. I mean, it comes back to the same argument, which is, I mean, the word I always use is repertoire, which is that if you going back to that head, heart and hand 3x3 grid, if you're trying to teach a curriculum that is that varied, then you can't just stand at the front and impart knowledge, which is, in the end, you can do some of that, and some of that's important, but that becomes boring year after year. If you've got to learn how to teach oracy, how to teach well-being, how to set up your classroom as a workshop, how to work in small groups and large groups, then the profession becomes a 30-year profession. It's not a 5-year or 2-year profession, because you've got so much to learn. And I think as a teacher, given the variety of this curriculum, I'm at the footholds of that. Something like project-based learning, that occasionally in education gets a bad name, which is bringing two subjects together, interdisciplinary learning, it can be done incredibly badly. It is a real craft to be able to do that with high quality outcomes. And I don't think at our school, until you've been teaching it 2 or 3 years, you do it really well. So that's another example. This profession then becomes exciting, becomes entrepreneurial, layered, intellectual, collaborative, instead of one-dimensional and sort of treadmill-like. So all of this that I talked about today is how you keep more people in the profession. It changes what it is to be a teacher.
So, I mean, I suppose the question again is kind of inputs and outputs, right? And how, how do you ensure that people coming into the teaching profession also have that breadth of skills? You described yourself as a history teacher. I think you were a history graduate. You came in with that narrow focus on some level. You're quite unusual in that respect, or are you not unusual that you were then able to step beyond your subject matter into a broader?
Well, I was unusual in that I do love history, but I was never kind of, there's a cliche in education that primary school teachers teach children and secondary teachers teach subjects. And I'm afraid that's quite true. The number of people who come into secondary schools, we may know some of them from our own schooling, who don't actually like children very much. That's only a small number, but they're there to impart physics knowledge. And what they want is for every child to love physics. And that's not a terrible thing. That's partly what brings it alive. But that is a problem for this expansive education. We need, and when we recruit, we're recruiting people deliberately who can reach beyond their subject. Because we say you're going to be a coach of 13 students and you're going to have 4 hours a week, which is more than some teachers will teach that child for their for their discrete subject. 4 hours with 12 students being their coach in all the different layers. And that terrifies them, because they hadn't thought that that's partly what they're going in for. So we do a lot of training to make that possible and to reach beyond their subject. But in a way, we need for that aspect of teaching more of a primary mindset, which is we're here to develop the potential of every child.
And is your experience that therefore you have higher staff retention, that they are on that 30-year journey with you rather than?
Yes, I mean, we go through ups and downs. So at times, one of our great challenges, look, there are real difficulties in doing some of what we're doing at different points. It's not easy, to be in an area where you've got a lot of need from the children, and you're trying to straddle getting a good Ofsted and good exam results just to get the basics right, because we couldn't escape that accountability, and we're trying to innovate. So some teachers, when we haven't been careful, we've asked them to do head, heart and hand, and they're out of their comfort zone too much of the time, because they'd rather just stick with an aspect of head. So when we've got it wrong, we've had staff not liking it. When we've recalibrated and put in more training and taken it more systematically, I think the teachers love this way of doing things. So again, it's not an easy thing to pull off.
I mean, I suppose that the other kind of commonplaces of education are sort of, the students and the space. So I suppose I ought to ask about those a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, has your sense been that the student body that you've worked with is as excited by this as you are? And how much of that is because of the kind of inspirational leadership that you're able to provide? And is it therefore kind of replicable in other similar social settings where you don't have that level of inspiration, or you don't have the ability to start again as you did?
I mean, for a young person, they don't know what they don't know, or they don't know what another school down the road, I mean, they can talk to their mates or whatever. So of course, at School 21, we kept saying to them, no one else is getting this, or collaborating with subject, and it kind of slightly washes over you if you're a 12-year-old or whatever. So was that
the logic of 4 to 18?
Well, the learning of 4 to 18 is you want. I mean, we did start the school with reception in year 7, so the first cohorts have only done, but now we're getting our first ever year 7s who've been there since reception. So it's all very exciting. They would have gone all the way. And yeah, look, you can see it. You can see it in big ways and small ways. This oracy stuff is transformational potentially. You know, we have parents who say my child is, you know, it's a sort of, you know, if you get it right, it's the end of the grunt, or maybe not quite the end, but the end of the grunting teenager, because actually it's so ingrained of them, that way of conversing, that actually we have lots of parents saying my child is now speaking to me in ways they've never done before. We've got lots of, you know, we had a teacher who came from a school half a mile away, identical intake, who said he was breaking up sort of 4 fights every lunchtime. He said, we haven't had a fight in 3 years since I've been here. And why is that? And one of the answers is, if you can speak in a sophisticated way and solve some of your problems through talking it out rather than hitting each other. So the point is, a lot of these things have impacts that are partly on the academics, but partly on other skills young people are learning. And our mission is that people go, that what's the point of the Head, Heart and Hand curriculum? It's so that young people go out and change the world. So we're not agnostic about what they do next. We want them to find their voice and make a difference. We care that they want to change their community and that they've got a value system, and that they can balance this head, heart and hand. That is the mission. That is the reason for doing Head, Heart and Hand.
And so when young people come into the school from outside later on in their educational journey, that kind of, is that, how much of a kind of culture shock is that? Because I think, you know, what you're describing is so different to the experience that is happening in most other schools. So how do you kind of help people to make that transition in?
Yeah, and we've got a real live sample. So because we're small in each year group, 75, and because we've got and half of those go on to apprenticeships or other things in year 11, going into year 12, our sixth form is made up, which is quite unusual, of about 120 external and 30 to 40 internal. Now, what that means is you've got a direct comparison, because when we have a discussion, one-to-one sessions with them before they join us, first of all, there are two striking things. One, immediately, the articulacy of ours who've been there many years is really striking. So when we have people holding those conversations who haven't kind of clocked this, they just say it's really striking. The other thing is that, going back to my phrase earlier about what's the currency of a school, we ask everyone to bring a piece of work they're proud of to those conversations for year 11 going into year 12. Every single external, without it, well, no, possibly with a couple of exceptions, bring a test result or an essay they've written for an exam. That's the thing they're most proud of, because there's no other currency. Ours, the 30 internal, all bring some extraordinary project they've done, something of real quality that they have produced in their time at the school. So that is the sort of evidence base that we get every year, that this is making a real difference. Then we've got to work bloody hard to integrate. So oracy, we've got to really up that in the culture of the sixth form, to give one example, and it happens lower down, we've got to do that. And we've got to very quickly do an induction into our ways of working, which is far more collaborative and teamwork and problem solving. So we're very clear about what that induction now needs to be.
So a word more about oracy and kind of voice 21. So the interesting thing about that stuff for me is that oracy seems to be the currency of informal education, right? It's the currency of hajjachar, of the stuff that we do within synagogue life.
Yes.
And so, you know, and it strikes me that so much of what you talk about is about kind of bringing some of that which we know from community life and from informal education into the school setting, which is sort of so enriched by having that within it. And oracy in particular seems, you know, if you ever go to a youth movement or a synagogue pula, you know, it's about standing up in front of people and talking. It's about making your case. It's about being in small groups, sitting in circles. I mean, it does feel like that's the space out of which so much of this comes.
Well, I joke with one of my co-founders, who was a Jewish youth leader, an OSY leader, that we're creating this sort of environment at our school in East London. I mean, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. And even more possibly amusingly, in year 9, we obviously don't call it this, but in year 9, everyone has a bar mitzvah. But we call it we at our school, every child in year 9 has a bar mitzvah, and we call it a rites of passage. And they produce, and it is a process over the year, they produce what we call, and there's been various charities have helped us with this as well, but it draws a lot on what we're talking about. They have a statement of who they are, and we call it the stand. And it is about who they want to be as an adult and how they're making the transition from childhood to adulthood. And there is a ceremony around it involving candles and various other things, but they help curate the ceremony. And they invite the people who mean the most to them, whether it's members of their family or friends or elderly relatives, and they come together for this moment where in their coaching group and with their family, they are saying what life means to them in a sort of really layered way. So that's just one example of some of the things we do. But all of it, the oracy is about that. It's about, look, for those who aren't used to it, and some of the families, there's not a lot of talk at home for various reasons, there are ways of structuring it that I think help all of us. I've learned from some of these techniques. I'm sharing immediately better than I used to because of some of the protocols and some of the ways of doing paired talk or thinking about things. It produces deeper thinking in the classroom, but also in the staff room. We talk about the dialogic staff room. The academics use the word the dialogic classroom. We talk about dialogic classroom, but also the dialogic staff room. And it is as much about how adults interact with each other as it is how students. The two are in parallel.
So I've had a couple of questions that I need to ask before we finish.
Sure.
One is about students with special educational needs and disabilities, and how that works in the sort of educational model that you're describing.
Yes, and we've got some really sophisticated teachers on that. And for us, some of the worst ways of teaching goes back to the main argument again, is lining everyone in rows, whatever their disability or special need is, again, and just having to sit tight all day, more or less. There was some, I don't know how they survey these things, an average child speaks for sort of 4 seconds a day in school, because if they're sort of not, they're asked a question in class maybe once every third lesson, they give a sort of 1-sentence answer, then they're just made to be quiet the whole day. That happens in most classrooms in most schools, more in secondary than in primary. So I think the normal way of educating is not very good for special needs often, although there's some really good special needs teachers. Our way, which is more variety, and you can tailor the curriculum more to those with special needs, I think has more going for it in terms of being more personalized. So we work very hard at that, and we've got special needs of all kinds in our school and again, it's always work in progress. We keep agonizing over, are we producing the real, the right diet for every single child, and we don't get it right the whole time.
So our last question, I suppose, with all of your background in politics and now in education, are you hopeful? Are you hopeful about the future of education in this country? You're describing the education that our kids should return to. Is it not more likely that they're going to return to the education that they had before March? How hopeful are you that we are in a period where there's that possibility of change?
It's a bit of a sitting on the fence answer. I think there'll be too many schools because of the exam pressure that think the only show in town is catch up. And some will buy into, which I don't, the reports in the press that this is now the lost generation because they're so far behind. I don't buy that 3 months of missed education out of 14 years is a lost generation at all. But I think because of the pressures on schools, a lot will think it's now academic catch up, get rid of everything else. You don't need to do as much creativity or sport or whatever. And I think that's a problem. So that's my pessimistic bit. I think, on the other hand, the pennies dropped with a lot more people, that we do need this balance, that we needed the balance during COVID. People needed well-being, they needed creativity, they needed to be active as well as thinking. And I've also sensed, because of, just to get political for a minute, because of so many multiple cock-ups from the government in terms of the advice to schools, and the way it was handled, and it's often been confused. I think a lot more school leaders have said, look, we've got to take this into our own hands now. We've got to shape our own profession. And actually, we kind of know how to do it better than often the politicians do. And so let's sort of go for it. So I'm seeing the sort of a sense out there that we can make things better, and we've got to sort of get on and do that. So I'm in that sense really optimistic.
It's a great way to end. Peter, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your wisdom this evening. I'm incredibly grateful to you. Grateful too to everyone who has given one of our lectures over the course of the last 4 months, to everyone who's been to the lectures. A particular thank you to Adam, who's hiding behind the Alyth A at the moment, who has made sure that the technology has worked every Thursday evening since the 16th of April. We are going to take a short summer break for these lectures. Peter, I hope you have a great summer and a restorative summer before you start all over again, far sooner than people probably realize, I imagine. And I wish you all a good evening, and thank you so much for being with us. Peter, thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.